Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we're going to do something a little bit different.
Oh,
Yeah, we're going to take a look at a specific country's economy.
okay. Sounds good.
Yeah, and this all stems from, I was doing some research and I came across this report,
Mm.
and it's called The State of the Economy.
Hmm.
And it's all about the Mauritian economy.
Okay.
Mauritius is an island nation in the Indian Ocean.
Right.
And, I was reading through this report and I thought this would be a really good deep dive episode
Sounds interesting.
because it highlights some things that I think are important to know and are also very interesting.
Okay, so what are some of the things that jumped out at you?
Well, one of the first things that really kind of hit me was that the report claims that there was some data manipulation
Oh, wow.
by the previous government to make the economy look better than it actually was.
So they were kind of cooking the books a little bit?
Yeah, that's kind of the implication.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a pretty serious accusation.
It is, and it makes you wonder what else might be hidden beneath the surface.
Exactly. So we're going to kind of peel back those layers and see what we can find.
Awesome. I'm ready to dive in.
All right, so let's start with the basics, the economic growth.
Okay.
So the report goes into detail about how the GDP growth rates were revised downward significantly.
Oh, wow. So things aren't as rosy as they might have seemed initially.
Not exactly. So,
Yeah.
for example, the 2023 growth rate was originally announced at 7%.
Which sounds pretty healthy.
Right. But they've now revised that down to 5.6%.
That's a pretty big drop.
It is. And the 2024 forecast also took a hit, going from 6.5% down to 5.1%.
So what's behind these downward revisions? Did they just get the numbers wrong the first time around?
Well, the report suggests that there was some, shall we say, creative accounting going on, particularly in the construction sector.
Okay, so they were maybe inflating those numbers to make things look better.
That seems to be the implication, and they're not holding back and pointing fingers at the previous government.
This is getting juicy. So they're saying the previous administration was essentially trying to pull a fast one on the public.
It kind of seems that way, and this ties into a broader theme in the report, which is a lack of transparency and accountability.
That's never a good sign when it comes to economic management.
Right. But here's where things get even more interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears.
The report shows that the nominal GDP in rupees is actually higher than it was in 2019.
So in their local currency, the economy has grown.
Yeah, but here's the catch. In U.S. dollar terms, the GDP is still lower than it was in 2019.
So even though they're seeing growth in rupee terms, their purchasing power on the global stage hasn't fully recovered.
Exactly, and that raises some serious questions about the real extent of their economic progress.
It's like they're running on a treadmill. They might be moving, but they're not actually getting anywhere.
It's a great analogy. It's like gaining weight but losing muscle mass.
Right. It's not real sustainable growth.
Exactly. And that brings us to another key issue highlighted in the report: declining investment.
Uh-oh, that doesn't sound good.
It's not the overall investment rate has been falling steadily, and that's a big concern because investment is the engine of economic growth.
Right. It creates jobs, drives innovation, and boosts productivity.
Exactly. And the report shows that back in 2010 to 2014, the average annual investment rate was 21.9%. But between 2015 and 2023, it dropped to 18.5%.
So a noticeable slowdown.
And what's even more worrying is that private sector investment, which is really the lifeblood of a market economy, has fallen even further.
How much further are we talking?
Well, it went from an average of 16.6% that earlier period down to just 14.1% in the more recent years.
That's a pretty significant drop. What's behind this decline?
Well, the report points to a number of factors, including a lack of confidence in the economic outlook.
Okay, so businesses are hesitant to invest because they're not sure what the future holds.
Exactly. And there are also concerns about policy uncertainty, regulatory hurdles, and a lack of access to finance.
So it's like a combination of internal and external factors that are creating this unfavorable investment climate.
Right. And if businesses aren't investing, it means fewer new jobs, less innovation, and slower economic growth.
And that creates a vicious cycle because the lack of growth further undermines confidence and discourages future investment.
Exactly. It's a trap that can be very difficult to escape.
And to make matters worse, the report highlights that a lot of the investment that is happening is concentrated in one particular sector, real estate.
The classic real estate bubble.
Well, not necessarily a bubble, but the report does express concern about the over-reliance on real estate investment.
How skewed is the investment towards real estate?
Well, get this. Over 70% of foreign direct investment in the first half of 2024 went into real estate.
Wow, so they're putting all their eggs in one basket.
Pretty much. And that's a risky strategy because if the real estate market takes a hit, the whole economy could suffer.
It's like building a house on a foundation of sand.
Exactly. And this lack of diversification in investment is another major concern highlighted in the report.
So it's not just about the quantity of investment, but also the quality and the distribution across different sectors.
Right, they need to create a more balanced and resilient economy.
Okay, so we've got manipulated GDP numbers, declining investment, and an over-reliance on real estate. What else is in this report?
Well, there's also a fascinating section on something called GBC services and how they impact the country's economic picture.
GBC services, what are those?
It stands for global business companies, and essentially these are companies that primarily work with clients outside of Mauritius.
So they're kind of like export-oriented businesses.
Exactly. But the interesting thing is that their activities weren't fully captured in the country's economic data.
So they were kind of flying under the radar.
In a way, and the report highlights that the IMF actually recommended that Mauritius adjust its calculations to include these GBC services in its export figures.
So it's like they discovered a hidden source of economic activity.
Kind of, and it has significant implications for how we understand the Mauritian economy.
Okay, so they're adding these GVC services to the export side of the equation. What about the other side?
Well, to keep things balanced, they also had to make some adjustments to other economic indicators like primary income to ensure consistency with the balance of payments.
So it's not just a simple addition. They have to make sure everything adds up.
Exactly. And the report actually mentions that they're still working with the IMF to refine these calculations.
Wow, so it's a pretty complex undertaking.
It is, but it highlights the challenges of measuring economic activity in a globalized world.
And it also shows the importance of having accurate and reliable data.
Absolutely. Without good data, it's impossible to make informed decisions.
Okay, so we've talked about data manipulation, declining investment, real estate concentration, and these GVC services. What else is on the agenda?
Well, the report also delves into the somewhat controversial topic of monetary policy.
Oh, this should be good.
They don't hold back in their criticism of the Bank of Mauritius.
What are they saying?
They're essentially arguing that the bank's policies were misaligned with the country's economic fundamentals and global trends.
So they were kind of out of sync with reality.
That's one way to put it. They specifically point to the bank's preference for higher interest rates on U.S. dollar-denominated assets.
And what was the impact of that?
Well, according to the report, it led to an acceleration of rupee depreciation and fueled inflation.
So the very problem they were trying to solve got worse.
It seems that way, and the report argues that this misaligned monetary policy had a significant negative impact on the economy.
This is fascinating stuff, but we're going to have to pause it there for today.
Oh, man.
But don't worry, we'll be back soon to continue our deep dive into the Mauritian economy. We'll pick up with the MIC controversy and see how all of these issues are impacting people's lives.
Can't wait.
See you soon.
Bye.
Okay, so we've talked about all this stuff at the high level, right?
Yeah.
But how does it actually affect people living in Mauritius?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we can talk about GDP and investment rates all day, but what does it mean for the average person?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we can talk about GDP and investment rates all day, but what does it mean for the average person?
Exactly. So let's get down to the ground level and see how these economic challenges are playing out in people's lives.
Let's start with inflation, because that's something that everyone feels in their wallets.
Yeah, for sure. It's been a major issue in Mauritius, and it's no surprise that it's one of the key concerns highlighted in this report.
Right. The report says that inflation actually peaked at 10.8% in 2022.
Oof, that's pretty high.
Yeah, it is. And while it's come down since then, it's still a real pain point for a lot of folks.
Especially for those on fixed incomes or with limited budgets.
Exactly. And the report actually argues that the inflation rate might be a little bit misleading because of what they call the base effect.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. So basically, because prices were so high in 2022, any increase in 2024 looks smaller in comparison.
Right. So even though the official inflation rate might say something like 3.7% as of November 2024,
Right.
things are still way more expensive than they used to be a few years ago.
It's all relative.
Yeah. And to give you an idea of just how much prices have gone up, the report has this table that shows the price increases for some basic necessities.
Oh, this is going to be painful.
Between October 2019 and October 2024, the price of corned beef increased by, get this, 114.4%.
What? That's insane.
It is. And cooking oil went up by 67.9%.
Wow, those are some serious price hikes.
Yeah, these are staples.
Yeah.
People need these things to survive.
Absolutely, and it's no wonder that people are struggling to make ends meet.
And when you compare Mauritius to other countries in the region, it kind of makes you wonder what's going on.
Okay, so how does Mauritius stack up?
Well, for example, the report shows that the cumulative inflation in Mauritius from 2022 to 2024 was 23%.
That's still pretty high.
Yeah, but in Seychelles during the same period, it was only 2.4%.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
And Seychelles actually experienced deflation in 2023.
So prices actually went down,
Yep, so it seems like Mauritius is kind of lagging behind when it comes to controlling inflation.
and it makes you wonder what they're doing differently or not doing.
Right, and the report actually suggests that some of the previous government's policies might have actually made inflation worse.
Oh, how so?
Well, they implemented a bunch of salary compensation schemes and financial support programs.
Which sounds like a good thing on the surface.
Yeah, it was meant to help people cope with the rising cost of living, but the report argues that it also fueled the price spiral.
So it's like they were trying to put out a fire with gasoline.
Exactly.
Yeah,
It was a well-intentioned but perhaps misguided approach.
it happens.
Okay, so we've got inflation hitting people's wallets. What about the job market? How's that looking?
Well, this is where things get a little bit puzzling.
Oh.
Yeah, because on the one hand, the report shows that the unemployment rate is relatively high.
How high are we talking?
It was 6.3% in 2023.
That's not great.
No, it's not. But at the same time, you have a lot of sectors complaining about labor shortages.
Wait, so you're saying there are a lot of people out of work, but businesses can't find workers?
That's the situation, and it seems contradictory, but there's a key factor at play here: skills mismatch.
Ah, so it's not just about having enough jobs, it's about having the right skills for the jobs that are available.
Exactly. The report points out that a significant portion of the unemployed lack even basic qualifications like the Cambridge School Certificate or equivalent.
How many people are we talking about?
Around 17,500?
So they might be willing to work, but they don't have the skills that employers are looking for.
Right, and this skills gap is a major challenge for the Mauritian economy.
And to make matters worse, the report says that there are actually a lot of foreign workers in Mauritius.
Really, how many?
Over 26,700.
Wow, so they're bringing in people from other countries to do jobs that could potentially be filled by Mauritians.
Yeah, it highlights the mismatch between the skills of the unemployed and the needs of the labor market.
It's a complex issue, and it's not an easy one to solve.
Definitely. And the report also delves into this concept of labor underutilization.
Oh, yeah, so it's not just about the unemployed. It's also about people who are working, but not to their full potential.
Right, so it includes people who are overqualified for their jobs or working fewer hours than they'd like to.
Exactly, and the report says that this underutilization rate is actually quite high.
How high?
It reached 23% in 2023.
Wow. So almost a quarter of the workforce is not being used effectively?
That's a lot of wasted potential.
And we can't forget about the gender disparities in the labor market.
Right. The report points out that women in Mauritius face significant challenges.
Like what?
Well, for starters, female labor force participation is much lower than in developed countries.
How much lower?
It's only around 47.5% compared to an average of 67% in developed countries.
So a lot of women are not even in the workforce.
And those who are actively seeking employment often face longer periods of unemployment than men.
So there are a lot of barriers for women in the workplace.
Definitely. And the report also mentions the issues of youth unemployment and brain drain.
Yeah, I've heard about that. So skilled professionals are leaving the country to find better opportunities elsewhere.
Exactly. And that's a big loss for the Mauritian economy.
It's like a double whammy. You've got young people struggling to find decent jobs and experienced professionals leaving the country.
Right. It's a real challenge.
Okay, so we've talked about inflation and the labor market. What about productivity? Is the Mauritian workforce at least becoming more efficient?
Well, that's a mixed bag. The report shows that labor productivity did increase by about 1.4% per year from 2019 to 2023.
So that's a good thing, right?
It's positive, but the problem is that average compensation grew much faster at around 7% per year.
So wages are rising faster than productivity gains.
Exactly, and that's not sustainable in the long run.
Why not?
Because it means that businesses are having to pay their workers more without getting a corresponding increase in output.
So it's like they're paying more for the same amount of work.
In a sense, and that can erode their competitiveness in the global market.
I see. And the report also mentioned something about capital and multi-factor productivity.
Right, those are measures of how efficiently capital and other inputs are being used in the production process.
Then what's the story there?
Well, the report points out that these measures are still below their 2019 levels.
So even though labor productivity has gone up, the overall efficiency of the economy hasn't fully recovered.
Exactly. It suggests that businesses are not investing enough in new technology or process improvements.
So there's still room for improvement.
Definitely. And that's one of the key challenges highlighted in the report.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground so far. Inflation, the job market productivity. But now it's time to address the elephant in the room.
Oh, what's that?
Public finances, or to put it bluntly, the government's budget.
Okay, yeah. This is where things start to get a little bit scary.
The report paints a pretty bleak picture of the state of public finances in Mauritius.
Like, how bleak are we talking?
But the actual budget deficit for the fiscal year 2023-2024 was Rs. 38 billion.
Ouch, that's a lot of money.
Yeah, it is. And that's equivalent to about 5.7% of the country's GDP.
So they're spending way more than they're taking in.
Exactly, and the projections for the next fiscal year are even worse.
Yeah.
They're estimating a deficit of Rs. 48.5 billion.
Yikes, that's almost 7% of GDP.
Yeah, it's a big problem.
Yep.
And the report identifies a number of reasons for this ballooning deficit.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, there's a revenue shortfall, meaning they collected less tax revenue than expected.
Okay, so less money coming in.
And on the spending side, there were increases in expenditures, particularly for salaries, social benefits, and transfers to these things called special funds.
Special funds, what are those?
They're basically funds that are set aside for specific purposes like infrastructure projects or social programs.
Okay, and what's the problem with them?
Well, the report says that the cash balances in these funds have been depleting rapidly.
So they're running out of money.
Yeah, they went from having Rs. 36.8 billion in June 2022 down to just Rs. 14.1 billion in June 2024.
Wow, that's a big drop.
And they're projecting that they'll have almost no funds left by June 2025.
So basically they're spending money they don't have.
Pretty much. And then there's this whole issue with the CSG.
CSG.
Yeah, it stands for Contribution Sociale Generalisée, the Social Security scheme.
Okay, I think I've heard of that.
So the problem is that the contributions that are being collected under the CSG are not enough to cover the payments that are being made out.
So they're running a deficit in the Social Security system.
Exactly, and that's a recipe for
Yeah,
disaster.
that's not sustainable.
And all of this brings us to the big scary word, debt.
Dun 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 dun.
Public sector gross debt has more than doubled since 2014.
More than doubled.
Yep, it went from Rs. 238 billion in December 2014 to Rs. 559.1 billion in June 2024.
Wow, that's a huge increase.
And that's equivalent to over 80% of the country's GDP.
So basically they owe more money than they produce in a year.
Pretty much. And the report points to a number of factors that have contributed to this debt surge.
Like what?
Well, there were some significant payouts for those controversial legal cases we talked about earlier.
Right, the XBAI, Betamax, and Neartown cases.
Exactly. Those cost the government a whopping Rs. 26.9 billion.
Ouch. And then there were the COVID-19 related expenditures.
Right, that was a big hit to public finances everywhere. And on top of all that, the depreciation of the rupee has made it even more expensive to repay the external debt.
Right, because that debt is denominated in foreign currencies.
Exactly. So it's a perfect storm of bad news for the government's balance sheet.
And just when you think it can't get any worse, the report throws in this concept of contingent liabilities.
Contingent liabilities, what are those?
They're basically potential financial obligations that the government might have to cover if certain things go wrong.
So it's like a hidden debt waiting to explode.
Exactly. And the report highlights a number of examples of these ticking time bombs.
Yeah.
Yeah, so for example, one of the big ones is Metro Express Ltd.
The light rail project.
Exactly. They borrowed USD 340 million from India to build that thing, and now the government's helping them with interest payments.
Okay, but that sounds manageable.
Well, the problem is that starting in the fiscal year 2026-2027, they have to start repaying the principal.
So the big payments are coming due?
And there are some serious doubts about whether Metro Express Ltd. Can actually handle those payments.
So if they can't pay the games to us, the government's on the hook for it.
That's the risk, and it's a big one.
Wow. So it's like the government co-signed a loan for a friend who might not be able to pay it back.
That's a good analogy, and this is just one example. The report goes on to list a whole bunch of these contingent liabilities.
Like what else?
Well, there's New Social Living Development Ltd. They're the ones responsible for building all those social housing units.
Right, the 8,000 units.
Yep. And they're relying heavily on government subsidies and bridging finance to make it happen.
So what's the risk there?
Well, if those funds dry up, for some reason, the government might have to step in and cover the shortfall.
Which could be billions of rupees.
Exactly. And then you've got the Central Electricity Board. They have a massive bank overdraft.
How massive?
Over as $5 billion?
Yikes. And then there's the STC. They're racking up a huge deficit, subsidizing essential goods like rice and flour and cooking oil.
Yep. And that deficit is recorded as a receivable from the government. So ultimately, the taxpayers are on the hook.
Man, it seems like everywhere you look, there's another potential financial time bomb ticking away.
It's not a pretty picture, and it really highlights the precarious state of public finances in Mauritius.
So basically, the government has made a lot of promises and commitments, but it's not clear how they're going to pay for it all.
That's the big question, and it's one that the report raises quite pointedly.
Well, okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've talked about data manipulation, declining investment, real estate concentration, GBC services, controversial monetary policy, inflation, a tight labor market with skills mismatches, low productivity, a ballooning budget deficit, a mounting debt burden, and these ticking time bomb contingent liabilities.
Wow, when you put it all together, it sounds pretty overwhelming.
It is, but the report doesn't just highlight the problems. It also offers some solutions, or at least some ideas for how to address these challenges.
Okay, so what are some of the key takeaways?
Well, I think one of the main things is that Mauritius needs to diversify its economy.
Right, they can't just rely on real estate and tourism. They need to invest in other sectors like manufacturing technology, renewable energy.
Exactly, and they also need to address those structural constraints we talked about.
Right, the labor market issues, the resource scarcity, the institutional weaknesses.
Yep, those all need to be tackled head on.
And of course, there's the looming threat of climate change.
That's a big one. Mauritius is a small island nation, so they're particularly vulnerable to things like rising sea levels and extreme weather events.
Absolutely. They need to invest in adaptation measures and transition to a more sustainable economy.
Yeah, and it's not just about the environment. It's about economic resilience and social well-being.
Right. Sustainability is about creating a future where people and planet can thrive together.
Well said. And I think this report really highlights the need for a more holistic approach to economic development.
I agree. It's not just about maximizing GDP growth. It's about creating an economy that works for everyone and that's built to last.
And that's going to require some tough decisions, some bold reforms, and a collective effort from all stakeholders.
It's a challenge, but it's not insurmountable.
Well, this has been a truly fascinating and somewhat sobering deep dive into the Mauritian economy.
I agree. It's given me a lot to think about.
Me too. And as always, we encourage you to check out the report yourself and dig deeper into the issues that we've discussed today.
Knowledge is power, and by understanding these challenges, we can hopefully start to find solutions.
Well, that's all the time we have for today, but we'll be back soon with another deep dive exploring a different corner of the world. Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
See you next time.